This is my younger brother's original DS Lite from way back in Christmas 2006, and it's safe to say it's seen better days. The hinge is broken, there's old tape on it, there's dirt in the creases, and I think it's about time we make this DS cooler than it ever was. So I loved my DS Lite, and it's still in pretty good condition. I still have it on display behind me on the wall there. But unfortunately, my brother's DS early on made a few mistakes that, shall we say, led it down a bad path, and as a perfectionist, it's honestly bothered me for a long time. So when the folks at ExtremeRate offered for me to check out their awesome custom shells, within the day I had a plan hatched to have his DS shipped to me so that I could operate on it here and make it even cooler looking than it was in 06. Now you may be asking, how is a pretty new shell going to fix the fact that the hinge is broken on the DS? But what you may not know is that the hinge is actually just a little locking mechanism right here in the corner that sits inside the upper screen's plastic shell. But commonly that upper portion would crack, and then the locking mechanism had nothing to hold on to, and then your device would just swing open and shut freely, which wasn't very ideal. So by swapping the shell on this DS for a shiny new one, we're both upping the aesthetic and fixing the hinge in a classic two birds one stone situation. And in this video we'll also cover how I fixed a dead D-pad during this process, because that's an issue that the motherboard that ended up in the DS had. But Coulter, you may ask, why did this DS get a new motherboard when you were just changing the shell? And that is because I made some mistakes, and the DS was not designed with repairability in mind. So unless you've cracked open at least a handful of devices in your day, I don't recommend taking on the DS Lite shell swap quite yet. There are plenty of other awesome ones on ExtremeRate's website, but until then, you can watch me screw up on this one. So everything started off super easy, like a Lego kit where I was just dumping out the pieces, following ExtremeRate's lovely guide video they provide to assemble the initial parts of the bottom case, move the GBA dummy card into its new shell, apply little foam stickers. Pretty easy stuff. Then we moved on to taking apart the donor DS, which went easily enough. Pulled off the rubber feet hiding the screws, popped out the screws, got the back shell off using the included pry tool. No problem. Then it was time to disconnect the mic and wireless card. Alright, easy peasy. And then the touchscreen digitizer's ribbon cable, to which I was like, no problem. I've taken apart a number of Apple products that are full of ribbon cables, so all good. And so with very little pressure applied to lift up the connector, I suddenly found the clamp arm of the connector lying on the table in front of me and no longer attached to the receiving connector. But I thought no big deal, looks like it came off cleanly, so I can just snap it back in there on reassembly. We'll worry about that later. And spoiler alert, it was not that simple, but we'll come back to that. So I proceeded with unplugging the top and bottom screens from the motherboard, to then proceed to a step that I did not expect, which was to pull out my air gun to pry the colored border off of the bottom screen. Honestly, I should have seen this coming, since obviously the original trim of your DS bottom screen might not match the new shell you're putting on there. And ExtremeRate was really nice in adding the border to the shell itself instead of making me glue a new one to the bottom screen, and so off came the border. Once I dialed in a good temp of about 200 degrees Fahrenheit and got my rhythm down, this was pretty easy, which is good because this would be the first of 3 more times I'd be getting the air gun out that day. And yes, that's more usages than the instructions call for, because more mistakes are to come. So on we went to disassemble the top half of the DS and extract the top screen, and yep, here's air gun usage number 2. Grab the speakers, mic, wireless cards, and here's airgun usage number 3 shortly after it to get the border and old protection layer off of the top screen. Then before I knew it, I was loading those parts into the top shell of the new screen assembly, meaning we had shifted into reassembly mode. So surely that means we're halfway through, right? You'll hear this mentioned on other teardowns of the DS Lite, I'm sure, but dang is it a pain to pass this top screen to motherboard ribbon cable through this little shaft in the hinge. Thankfully there's a little slot you can leverage, but I mean, talk about threading a needle, this was difficult. Now I get to pop the LED light corner onto the DS, which is also the corner that houses the hinge locking mechanism, which I so cleverly installed in the open position, making it that much more difficult to unite the top screen and motherboard shortly after, but it all worked out after some finessing. I hastily popped all the exciting new buttons onto the bottom shell, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and then it was time to plug the bottom screen back into the motherboard, meaning it was time to try out my easy peasy digitizer connector clamp fix. And short answer is, yeah, no, that didn't work. Partly because I don't have a microscope to properly thread that connector over the pins like it was originally, and partly because the connector shot out of my tweezers early in the attempt, so I instead tried creating enough contact from the ribbon cable to the connector with tape, but unfortunately, no dice on that. Because of that, I had a reshelled DS with a top and bottom screen working perfectly, but with no digitizer, that meant no touchscreen, and that was kind of an important feature on the DS. Thankfully, I'd recently grabbed a couple of partially broken DS's thinking I might use them for a video, so I popped one open and stole its digitizer connector clamp, thinking I'd be able to pop it on and call this project done, but I definitely misunderstood how the arm was supposed to plug into the connector, as it quickly snapped into a few pieces when I applied a little force to try and pop it back in, so now we were 2 arm clamps down and still no digitizer. It seemed to have less suspended pins than the new DS motherboard, so I started to think that maybe I'd done more damage than I thought on the first one and broke off a few pins, but that also could just be because that motherboard was basically a release model, so I thought it might have changed slightly over time. Regardless, I decided to cut my losses and just try the other motherboard instead, thinking that maybe it'll have better contact with the ribbon cable, even without the clamp. And again, the short answer is no. That clamp is very important for creating the proper connection between the ribbon cable and the connector, and so again, I had a DS with a top and bottom screen working, but no touchscreen. At this point, this project had gone on for many more hours than I had planned, and I knew I could order parts on AliExpress to pop them onto the original motherboard and keep all the original hardware together, but at this point, I just wanted a fully working DS sitting in my office before I went to sleep. So it was time to pull out kinda broken DS number 3, and this time we were going to take its motherboard as is, without borrowing parts or anything, just to try and keep that digitizer connector pristine. I took it apart, extracted its motherboard, and remembered that this DS was the one with the broken D-pad, so I guess we're going to try to fix that while we're in here. It turned out that some sort of black goop had just gotten under the D-pad, and so I removed the old membrane and then cleaned up the board with some isopropyl alcohol, and then we were looking good. I plugged in the screens, and now the bottom screen isn't working. What the heck? It had been working for all the other tests, so I don't know if the ribbon cable had just been moved too much or what, but at this point I knew I had another working bottom screen lying nearby from one of the cannibalized DS's spread across my office, which leads me to heat gun usage number 4, where I take off this screen's border. The black border would have been fine with the shell, but like I said, the border is now built into the shell, so I still had to take it off, and finally we had a known working top screen, bottom screen, motherboard, digitizer connection. So the moment of truth. Finally, we have all DS aspects working, including the D-pad, so that was a nice bonus fix in there. Top screen, bottom screen work great, touch screen, everything's happy, fantastic. Now I could finally move on to installing the bumpers, power slider, volume slider, and pop on the back shell to see this DS in all of its reshelled and now pretty much rebuilt glory. I zoomed through the setup prompts and took in the beauty that is the Nintendo DS home screen. Finally, it was time to test a game, and what better than the cinematic masterpiece tie-in game Garfield, A Tale of Two Kitties, which was the actual game my brother had ironically left in this DS for me to find. Thanks, bro. I popped in the game and crap. I never tested if this new motherboard could read DS cards fine. At this point, the sun was well down outside, and I was not going to sleep well with such an abrupt failure in this project, and so I turned to the ancient methods passed down by our ancestors to solve problems like this. That's right, 3 big puffs of air and some desperate quiet prayers, and this DS was reading Garfield, A Tale of Two Kitties, as it was always supposed to. Which means this reshell was complete, and although I accidentally turned this into much more of a thing than it needed to be, I'm still super glad I did this project, as I think the results speak for themselves. The buttons feel even better than before with the new membrane pads that come with the kit, the matte finish just looks so cool and premium, and of course, a feature my brother hasn't seen working on this DS in nearly 20 years, it has a fully working hinge. Now if you're tackling this project at home, I have compiled a few tips from my adventures that'll hopefully make your project a little safer and more successful. First, as you should obviously know by now, be very gentle with the digitizer connector and only lift up on the black plastic tab from the DS card end of the motherboard and not the GBA card end. The GBA card end is where you slide in the cable, and then the opposite end is where you lift up the tab just very carefully and only the plastic portion. Also, I don't know why I didn't use mine in this video, and it's probably bugging the heck out of some of you, but use a screw management tray if you have one, or something to keep the many screws safely on the table. Another is that I do recommend doing this little battery hold power on test if you can. That way you know that both screens are happily connected and the touchscreen is working fine before you go to all the work of installing the bumpers and back shell. Speaking of the screens being happy, I learned that if you turn it on and the top screen flashes and then the whole thing turns off, that means that the bottom screen is likely not connected properly. Who knew? And when plugging in the top screen and bottom screens, which is a bit of a feat since they have next to no slack, for the top screen I would slide it in as much as I could by gripping the ribbon cable and screen like this, and then before clamping the tab down I would just push the cable along a little more using a spudger and those little tabs near the end of the ribbon cable, and then using your thumbnail when you can to flip those connector tabs up and down since they look pretty fragile. And lastly, make sure the bumper springs are staying in place without you having to hold them there, because if they're sliding off on their own without the back shell on, they're still going to do that with the back shell on, so make sure they're sitting pretty happy, and then you can hopefully avoid having to open it back up after installing the backplate. That's all for today. Thanks so much for watching, and let me know in the comments if you're going to take this mod on, or if you're going to check out any of the other shells that ExtremeRate offers, which probably will be a little easier to install. Subscribe to help out the channel. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.